What if saving your family's legacy meant marrying the one person you can't stand? The Montana wind bit through Eliza's coat as she stepped off the small charter plane, carrying her from the bustling chaos of Chicago to the vast, unyielding expanse of her father's ranch. The fields stretched endlessly, golden wheat swaying under the harsh, cold gusts. Silos stood like silent sentinels, their steel sides catching the weak morning light. Mountains loomed in the distance, gray and immovable, a reminder that this land had endured far longer than any family, any human ambition. She hugged her coat tighter, not just against the cold but against the weight of what awaited her. The funeral had been just the beginning. The will, her father's final, calculated maneuver, loomed over her like a specter. She had returned reluctantly, expecting grief and a brief encounter with her father's legacy. What she found instead was a trap disguised as an inheritance. Jake was waiting at the edge of the long driveway, his frame rigid, hands folded over his chest, eyes scanning her like a man who had seen everything and trusted very little. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a lifetime spent bending to the demands of the land etched into the lines of his face and the hardness in his posture. He wasn't the owner, never had been, but he had managed the ranch for decades, knowing every irrigation ditch, every silo, every rusted bolt that held the vast operation together. And now, legally, he was bound to her, whether he liked it or not. "Miss Eliza," he said, his voice carrying over the wind with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years in command of things that could not speak back. "We need to discuss your father's will. The stipulations." She turned to face him, meeting his sharp gaze with equal intensity. There was no softness, no welcome, only measured evaluation. "The conditions?" Her voice was calm, almost clinical. "I read it. You're saying I must marry you to gain control of the ranch? That I cannot act alone? That's preposterous." Jake's jaw tightened. "It's not preposterous. It's the law. Your father's last directive. And Silas has already filed suit. If you refuse, you get nothing. He will take everything, contracts, land, even what little security remains for the workers. He won't hesitate." Eliza turned toward the silos in the distance, their cold steel faces catching the light. She had never intended to return to this world of dirt, dust, and machinery. Yet here she was, and her father had ensured that she could not leave without submission. "He thinks I'll be a puppet, easily manipulated," she said bitterly. "And now, I'm supposed to marry you? To save what? A bunch of contracts?" "Yes," Jake said. His voice was clipped, controlled. "Legally, minimally. But this is the only way to stop Silas. We both have no choice. You want control, I want security. This is survival." The silence stretched, long and heavy, interrupted only by the whistle of the wind across the plains. Neither of them knew the other, neither trusted the other. Antipathy ignited instantly. She saw him as a rugged, unpolished man, deeply rooted to land and labor. He saw her as a sharp, cold city woman, someone who had never lifted a plow or adjusted a valve herself. Both of them were already counting the cost of shared existence. "So, we marry," she whispered, as if saying it aloud made it more real, more binding. "Yes," he confirmed. "For survival, and to protect what matters most." Her hands clenched into fists, nails pressing into her palms. "I never planned to return here, and I never imagined living with someone I despise. Not for a year. Not under any circumstances." Jake's lips pressed into a thin line, the wind tugging at his coat. "Then you'll have to learn to tolerate me. That's all I can promise." The first step had been taken at the county clerk's office, a sterile room with fluorescent lights and the faint smell of disinfectant. Pins scratched signatures onto paper that would bind them together for a year. Legalese, clauses, contingencies, every word a link in the chain that neither could escape. Eliza read every line twice, measuring every syllable, weighing her future against her sense of pride and autonomy. Jake watched her silently. He had signed many documents in his life, contracts for equipment, leases for land, agreements for workers, but this one was different. It wasn't just business. It was binding his life to hers in a way that felt unnatural and invasive. And yet, he understood it was the only way to protect everything he had spent decades building, and to survive the ruthless advance of Silas. Outside, The wind whipped across the plains, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, an inconsequential noise, yet strangely solemn. The ranch itself seemed to acknowledge the shift, the beginning of an uneasy alliance. They were enemies by circumstance, bound by law, forced into a partnership to oppose a common threat. Eliza closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in the scent of the earth, the dust, and the faint tang of machinery. It was foreign to her, suffocating and raw, yet undeniably alive. She opened them, meeting Jake's gaze again, and for the briefest instant, there was recognition, not trust, not warmth, not love, only the cold acknowledgement that their fates were intertwined. The deal with the devil had been made. Both of them knew the consequences of failure. Silas would take everything, and their lives, freedom, and dignity would be collateral. And yet, they had no other choice. They stepped back outside, the wind carrying the promise of challenges ahead. Each knew that this union would test them, break them, and perhaps, in the unlikeliest of ways, reshape them. The first day of their forced marriage had begun, and with it, the slow, inevitable collision of two worlds, urban sharpness and rural grit, cold intellect and enduring strength, pride and survival. Neither could imagine what would come next, but both understood, in the marrow of their bones, that their lives, and the land that had ruled them all, would never be the same again. The county clerk's office was sparsely furnished, the kind of sterile room where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else in Montana. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, casting a pale glow over the polished linoleum floor. Eliza and Jake sat side by side at the long, narrow table, their shoulders tense, their eyes deliberately avoiding each other. There was no warmth here, no pretense of connection, only the weight of obligation. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with a quiet patience born of years of witnessing human compromise, slid the paperwork toward them. "This is the marriage certificate and the supplemental agreement your late father required. Please review and sign where indicated." Her voice was calm, neutral, almost indifferent. Eliza took a deep breath and ran her fingers over the edges of the papers, her mind racing. Every clause was a cage. Every line, every stipulation in legalese, tethered her to a man she barely knew, in a union she despised. The first paragraph was straightforward. The marriage itself, ceremonial and legal. But the supplemental agreement was the true instrument of control, a year of shared management over the ranch, shared authority over financial decisions, and explicit limitations on any personal or romantic interaction. It was designed to prevent intimacy, ensure cooperation, and, above all, safeguard the property from Silas's interference. Jake's hand brushed against the stack of documents as he lifted his pen. He looked at her briefly, just a fraction of a second, before returning his gaze to the contract. His mind was focused on calculations far beyond legalese. Payrolls, equipment leases, the maintenance schedules of silos, irrigation systems, and livestock. Every signature was more than ink on paper. It was survival. Every clause he agreed to bound him not just to Eliza, but to a strategy to preserve the ranch and protect his own life. Eliza broke the silence. "You understand the terms, don't you?" Her tone was sharp, precise, almost accusatory. No personal involvement, no interference in each other's private lives beyond what's legally necessary, cooperation only as required by the contract. Jake nodded once, curtly. "I understand. And I agree. On paper, this is strictly business. No feelings. No distractions." His eyes flicked to hers for the briefest moment, and she caught a trace of something she could not immediately define. Resolute commitment, perhaps, or a warning. They signed the papers. The ink was permanent, binding, and for both of them, profoundly uncomfortable. The clerk congratulated them softly, handing over a small stack of certified copies. "Congratulations," she said again, her tone neutral, almost robotic. "You're officially married." Outside the office, the sun was already climbing over the distant mountains, burning gold onto the fields. The wind pushed at them, cold and relentless, and Eliza felt it press against her skin like a reminder that her life had irrevocably changed. She glanced at Jake. He stood rigid, hands in his pockets, scanning the horizon as though anticipating some unseen threat. Not a glance, not a word of congratulations, nothing that could be mistaken for camaraderie. Their first drive back to the ranch was silent. Jake's truck was large, utilitarian, perfect for the sprawling property. The interior smelled faintly of leather and machine oil. Eliza sat stiffly in the passenger seat, notebook and legal documents on her lap. She traced the lines of the supplemental agreement, already memorizing the limitations and obligations imposed on her life for the next year. Jake spoke only when necessary. The house is secure. Workers are in place. I'll brief you on operations once we arrive. Any attempts to circumvent the agreement will jeopardize your authority here. His tone was flat, professional, almost detached. She nodded, barely breathing. Understood. The main house of the ranch loomed as they approached, a massive structure of weathered timber and stone, its windows reflecting the midday sun. It was designed for function, but it carried a weight of history, of generations who had worked this land. Inside, the hallways were empty, the furniture positioned with precision, each room a reminder of legacy and authority. They moved through the house with the care of strangers sharing a space reluctantly. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, every echo of footsteps emphasizing the distance between them. Meals were eaten in silence, conversations limited to operational matters, livestock, harvest schedules, equipment maintenance. There was no laughter, no small talk, no acknowledgement beyond the bare necessities of communication. Eliza explored the house later that evening, walking through rooms that had once been part of her childhood. Her fingers traced the edge of a polished oak desk, lingered on a brass handle of a cupboard. The smell of old wood and dust brought back memories of simpler times, but she could not dwell on them. Not with Jake present, not with the knowledge that every movement, every word, could be scrutinized in the context of their contract. Jake, meanwhile, moved through the mechanical side of the ranch, the elevators, the storage bins, the machinery that kept this empire alive. He reviewed logs, checked valves, inspected the feed and irrigation lines. His life was measured in gears, pressure readings, and schedules. Yet now, all of it was entangled with Eliza's presence, with the cold legality of their union. He hated it. He hated her intrusion into his world, but he also knew it was necessary. She had the authority to challenge him at any moment, and Silas was already circling, waiting for the slightest misstep. That night, they slept in separate rooms, doors closed, silence thick between them. Yet the house felt different, alive with the tension of shared purpose. Eliza lay awake, thinking of the contract, of Jake's presence, of the looming threat of Silas. She hated this forced closeness, hated the way it made her acknowledge him, yet could not ignore the faint impression that he was competent, capable, perhaps even honorable in a way no one else on the ranch had been. Jake, in his room, stared at the ceiling, counting the hours of darkness, listening to the wind moan through the rafters. He did not want her here, did not want to rely on her, and yet the law, the will, and the threat of Silas forced them together. He knew one wrong move could destroy everything he had worked for, and he knew that Eliza's mind, her knowledge, her legal expertise, would be both a threat and an asset. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the first day of their cold marriage was over. They had survived it, not by friendship, not by trust, but by necessity. The deal had been struck. The terms were clear. The challenge was enormous, and neither of them would admit it, but a fragile, unspoken understanding had begun to take root. They were bound together, for better or worse, in a fight against a man who would see them both destroyed if given the chance. The ranch was quiet once again, but beneath the stillness, tension coiled like a predator. The year ahead promised conflict, danger, and tests of character that neither Jake nor Eliza could yet imagine. And yet, neither could deny the truth of their situation. Survival depended on cooperation, whether they liked it or not. Their forced partnership had begun, and already, each sensed that life on this land would never feel the same again. The morning sun had barely risen when Eliza and Jake heard the low rumble of engines approaching the ranch. From the hilltop, the dust clouds signaled more than just routine traffic. They signaled scrutiny. Silas was already moving his pieces, as always, anticipating, manipulating, using the law and the authorities as weapons. Eliza's hands tightened around the steering wheel of her truck as she and Jake drove toward the storage terminals. Her mind was racing, replaying every clause of the supplemental agreement. She had spent the night reviewing contracts, memorizing the language that tied her to this land, to this man, to a year of forced co-governance. But legality offered no protection against corruption, and Silas thrived on it. Jake, seated beside her, was calm in appearance, but his eyes were scanning the surroundings with precision honed over decades. "Sheriff and tax inspectors," he said quietly. "Silas must have bribed them. They're here to challenge the legitimacy of this marriage, to find a technicality that invalidates your authority over the ranch." Eliza exhaled slowly. "So we perform. Play the part of a real married couple." Her tone was bitter, sarcastic, but there was no escaping the reality of it. Fake affection, fake warmth, all for appearances. "Exactly," Jake replied. His voice was flat, measured. "Keep it controlled. Keep it convincing. Any slip-ups, any visible tension, and Silas will have his lawyers all over us." The inspectors arrived in the form of a lean sheriff, accompanied by a younger deputy and a middle-aged tax officer with a clipboard that seemed to weigh as much as his authority. They moved across the property with exaggerated interest, inspecting barns, silos, and even the main house. Their eyes lingered on Eliza and Jake, scrutinizing body language, the subtle cues of interaction, or lack thereof. Eliza found herself walking slightly closer to Jake than she would have chosen, her posture stiff, her mind calculating every gesture, every smile that might appear genuine to the trained eyes of outsiders. Jake mirrored her movements just enough to maintain the illusion. They moved as strangers forced into choreography, polite nods, minimal conversation, shared attention toward inspections, nothing more. As they approached the central office of the ranch, the tension became almost physical. Jake whispered, low and precise, "Remember, legal obligation only. If they ask about personal relations, be neutral, unreactive. We're a business unit under contract, not a couple." Eliza nodded, biting the inside of her cheek to keep her voice from trembling. She hated the charade. She hated being forced into proximity with him, hated pretending to care, hated seeing him perform affection he did not feel. And yet, she could not deny the faint flicker of something. A recognition of competence, authority, and the undeniable reality that they needed each other to survive this attack. The sheriff asked questions about the property, the contracts, and the management of the ranch. Eliza answered crisply, citing clauses from her father's will, explaining her authority, referencing contracts Jake had signed decades ago. Jake added operational details, each word precise, confident, controlled. Together, they created an image of cooperation that was almost believable. Two professionals executing a shared duty, with no room for scrutiny to exploit. During one brief pause, the tax officer leaned toward Eliza, eyes narrowed. "Are you two really married?" he asked, suspicion threading his tone. Eliza's lips curved into the faintest, measured smile. "Legally, yes. Contractually, yes. Beyond that, you'll have to ask the courts." Her voice was calm, controlled, deliberately evasive. Jake placed a hand on her back in a gesture that was small, almost imperceptible, yet enough to convey solidarity. It was not affection, it was strategy, protection, and necessity. Eliza felt the brush of his presence, an involuntary acknowledgement of reliance, and a twinge of something that went beyond the contract. By the time the inspectors departed, satisfied, or perhaps merely thwarted by the duo's calculated cooperation, Eliza and Jake stood alone on the porch of the main house. The dust settled slowly over the fields, a quiet aftermath, but both knew it was only the first strike in Silas's campaign. Eliza broke the silence. This performance, it's nauseating." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I can't believe we're pretending to be married in front of them." Jake's eyes met hers, sharp and unreadable. "It's survival. And right now, survival comes first. The rest, whatever happens between us, can wait." They returned inside, the empty halls of the house echoing their footsteps. The house felt colder, the silence heavier, now that they had enacted the first layer of deception. And yet, in the unspoken moments, in the small gestures of coordination, a subtle understanding began to form. They were opponents, yes, but necessary allies. For the moment, necessity bridged the gap that disdain had carved so deep. Eliza sat at the edge of the grand dining table, flipping through notes and contracts, while Jake reviewed operational logs on the nearby computer. Neither spoke, yet both were acutely aware of each other's presence. The proximity that was forced, the tension that crackled invisibly between them. It was the first taste of the paradox that would define their marriage. Proximity enforced by law, cooperation demanded by necessity, and the faint, unacknowledged recognition that survival required unity, even when unity was despised. Outside, the ranch stretched vast and silent under the late morning sun. But within its walls, tension simmered. The year ahead promised a gauntlet of scrutiny, sabotage, and tests neither Jake nor Eliza could yet imagine. And while the contract bound them legally, the real challenge, learning to navigate each other's minds, motives, and hidden strengths, was only beginning. The day had barely begun when the first alerts sounded from the east silo. Jake was already on his feet before the tone even finished echoing through the control room. Machines hummed and whined, pressure gauges flickered, and the automated warning lights cast a harsh red glow over the polished metal surfaces. Something was wrong, something that could escalate fast if ignored. Eliza followed Jake through the narrow corridors of the silo complex, her heels clicking against the concrete floor in an unfamiliar rhythm, each step highlighting her inexperience with the mechanics of the ranch. Jake moved ahead with purpose, checking valves, reading gauges, calling out instructions to the workers already scrambling to respond. His body language was precise, confident, and completely in command, a man utterly at home in chaos. "This valve here is leaking," Jake said, his voice calm but sharp. "Pressure's rising too fast. Move the feed line to secondary flow. I'll handle the main stabilizers." Eliza's heart thumped in her chest, part fear, part awe. She had never witnessed this level of operational expertise. Do you always handle everything yourself?" she asked, her voice barely above the sound of the alarms. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tightened a wrench on a stubborn coupling, eyes fixed on the gauge. "I trust myself first. Others second. Right now, we don't have the luxury of mistakes." She swallowed her pride and stepped closer, flipping open her notebook. Legal clauses, safety protocols, risk assessments, things she could contribute. "I can monitor regulatory compliance. Make sure this doesn't turn into a liability. If the inspectors ask for logs." Jake glanced at her, a flicker of respect crossing his expression. "You can track the logs. Make sure the numbers match reality. If the county comes sniffing, it's your word they'll have to trust." For the first time, Eliza felt a shift. He wasn't just a stubborn, rural caretaker. He was a man responsible for life and machinery, someone who carried the weight of the ranch with silent resolve. And he trusted her, not emotionally, not yet, but professionally. It was enough to ignite a strange, grudging respect. Minutes stretched into tense hours. The leak worsened as the main valve threatened to fail under increasing pressure. Jake crawled along the metal catwalks, hands slick with oil and sweat, while Eliza coordinated from the control desk, calling out readings, documenting each move for the inevitable reports that would follow. "Secondary line stable. Flow redirected. Watch the main pressure gauge," Jake called, his voice cutting through the whine of machinery and the shouting of workers. Eliza nodded, scribbling furiously, "Main gauge holding at 112 psi. Maximum allowed 115. You've got a 3-minute buffer before critical failure." Jake's jaw tightened. "Good. Keep it precise. Don't let the numbers lie. Not now, not ever." In that confined, mechanical chaos, the first real connection formed, not through words or sentiment, but through coordinated action. Eliza realized that survival, here, wasn't about emotions. It was about intelligence and execution working in tandem. And for the first time, she saw Jake not as a mountain of stubborn pride, but as the only person capable of keeping the ranch alive. The crisis reached its peak when a pressure regulator threatened to rupture. Jake lunged, twisting the massive wrench, his muscles straining against the metal. Sparks flew from friction, the smell of heated steel filling the air. Eliza held her breath, fingers tight around her notebook, heart hammering. One wrong move, one delayed reaction, and disaster would strike. Finally, with a low hiss and a clank that echoed through the complex, the regulator held. The pressure stabilized. Alarms ceased. Machines hummed back into their normal rhythm. Workers exhaled collectively, The immediate danger passed. Jake leaned against the railing, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't speak at first, simply watching Eliza as she checked her logs, confirming the operational numbers matched the reality she had witnessed. Then he nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. You did well. The paperwork was accurate, your timing precise. I might trust you with this next time. Eliza blinked, taken aback. Trust. Not affection, not admiration, but recognition of competence. For a woman who had only seen the world through contracts and legal language, it was a revelation. She realized he was not just an obstacle to her independence. He could be an ally. And more than that, she understood that she needed him as much as he needed her. The ride back to the main house was silent in a different way than before, still tense, still formal, but underpinned by a new current, professional respect. Each step they had taken in the chaos of the silo had built a foundation, however fragile, of partnership. That night, as they surveyed the ranch from the high porch of the main house, the golden Montana sunset painting the fields with fire and shadow, Eliza allowed herself a brief thought. Maybe, just maybe, surviving here would require more than law and logic. Maybe it would require understanding, and even, eventually, accepting the man she had been forced to marry. But the wind carried reminders that Silas was still out there, scheming, waiting for them to falter. The crisis had been resolved, but the battle was far from over. And both Jake and Eliza knew, in the marrow of their bones, that the next move could cost more than pride. It could cost their lives, their legacy, or the land they had been forced to defend together. The house was quiet that evening, yet every shadow felt charged, every creak in the floorboards a possible sign of intrusion. Silas had made his intentions clear. The marriage was not only a legal obstacle, it was a stage, a trap designed to catch them in even the smallest error. Cameras hidden in the corners of the main living areas, microphones masked within smoke detectors. They were watching. Every whispered word, every glance, every movement would be scrutinized. Eliza and Jake had quickly realized the implications. Private conversations were impossible. Even in the privacy of what should have been their own home, they were performers in a show directed by a ruthless uncle with unlimited resources. The contract had forced them together, and now surveillance forced them into a closeness neither wanted, but they could not afford to resist. That night, a storm swept across the plains, rattling the shutters and sending cold gusts through the house. Jake and Eliza had been summoned by a fabricated concern about a minor malfunction in the irrigation system. The task required them to share the same bedroom temporarily, to avoid cameras that monitored the hallways and main operational offices. It was a ridiculous arrangement, but necessity dictated it. They sat on opposite sides of the narrow bed, maintaining a strict physical boundary, yet the room felt too small, every sound amplified. The storm outside mirrored the tension within, winds moaning through the eaves as lightning illuminated the corners of the room. Silence stretched until Eliza finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like this is pointless?" she asked. "All this surveillance, this charade, we're prisoners in our own lives." Jake's eyes remained on the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. "Pointless doesn't keep Silas from taking everything. We do this because we have to. Nothing else matters." Her gaze flicked toward him, taking in the sharp line of his jaw, the stubborn set of his shoulders. For a moment, she saw not a rural brute, but a man who carried decades of responsibility alone. "I know," she admitted softly. "It's just hard to imagine connecting with someone under these conditions." He exhaled slowly, a rare display of fatigue. "Connection isn't an option right now. Survival is." But his voice trailed, hesitant, as if revealing even a sliver of emotion could undo him. "We do need each other, whether we like it or not. That's the reality." A crack of thunder rattled the window, and instinctively, Eliza scooted closer, not quite touching, but close enough that the warmth of shared air seemed to break some invisible barrier. She didn't want to admit the relief, but the presence of another human being who understood the stakes, who was trapped in the same impossible position, was unexpectedly comforting. Jake followed her lead, subtle, careful, maintaining the strictest propriety while acknowledging the reality that their survival often required proximity. Words flowed between them in whispers now, soft, private, discussing everything from past losses to childhood memories, stories never shared with anyone else. Each revelation was a brick in the wall of trust slowly building between them. I never wanted this life, Eliza confessed, her voice breaking slightly. I wanted Chicago, law firms, independence. And now, here I am, a part of a world I barely understand, bound to someone I barely know. Jake listened, silent, letting her speak. I've never had a choice either, he finally admitted. This land, it's my life. But I never owned it. I just managed it for others, and I've been trapped under the weight of that responsibility. And now, I'm trapped with you. The shared acknowledgement of confinement, of mutual burden, created a fragile bridge between them. For the first time, they weren't just partners in a charade. They were two humans, vulnerable, fearful, and bound together by circumstance. Hours passed with whispered conversation, strategic planning, and occasional quiet laughter at small, private jokes born from shared discomfort. The storm outside began to abate, but inside the room, a different storm simmered, a storm of suppressed emotions, reluctant understanding, and the first spark of mutual respect that neither could yet define. By dawn, the first tentative connection had been made. They were still bound by contract and law, still wary, still distrustful in many ways, but they had glimpsed the potential of something more than survival. They had discovered that even under surveillance, even under duress, humanity persisted. The house was silent again, save for the faint creak of the floorboards as they each retreated to separate corners, careful to maintain appearances, careful not to admit what had shifted overnight. And yet, each carried the quiet knowledge that, in the long year ahead, proximity under duress might prove not only a weapon against Silas, but also the crucible in which a deeper bond would form. The morning sun fell in thin, pale beams across the main house as Eliza sifted through the paperwork Silas had sent her via an anonymous courier. She had suspected his interference, of course, but the weight of actual proof hit differently. There were bank statements, liens, and old loan contracts, evidence of Jake's debts, obligations, and financial entanglements that he had never disclosed. The implication was clear. Jake had married her for personal gain, to manipulate the contract and the ranch for his own survival. Her hands trembled slightly as she read each line, each number, each legal reference that painted Jake not as a protector, but as a self-serving schemer. A pit formed in her stomach. The trust she had begun to form during the forced intimacy of the previous night now cracked under the weight of suspicion. Jake entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of coffee, unaware of the documents spread across the table. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral, casual, yet there was an underlying tension. He could sense the shift in the air. Eliza looked up, her eyes hard. "Do you deny this?" She slid the first document toward him. "All of it? The debts? The liens? The contracts? Or are you going to tell me this is another manipulation by Silas?" Jake set the coffee down slowly and studied the papers. He ran a hand through his hair, then leaned against the table, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I've owed money," he admitted, voice low. "Yes, not all of it is current. And yes, some old contracts went poorly. But every move I've made was to protect the ranch, to ensure it didn't collapse. I didn't marry you for money. I married you because it was the only way to survive Silas's attack, just like you agreed." Eliza felt anger surge, sharper than the Montana wind outside. "You expect me to believe that after all this? That I should trust you now, after finding this on my own?" "I don't expect you to trust me," Jake said quietly, tone firm but not defensive. "I expect you to understand the stakes. Silas will use anything he can to turn us against each other. These debts, these contracts, they're bait. He wants you to see me as a threat, as a con man. But he won't succeed if we're smart. Together." Her hands slammed onto the table, the noise echoing in the quiet house. "Together? How am I supposed to believe anything you say? How do I know this isn't another strategy?" Jake stepped closer, closing the gap without breaking any of the legal or professional boundaries they had established. "Because you've seen me in action. At the silo, with the machinery, with the workers. I risked everything to stabilize the operation. I risked my life, Eliza. Not for contracts, not for money, for the ranch. And yes, by extension, for you." Her chest heaved, emotions warping into a cocktail of suspicion, relief, and frustration. And you think that absolves decades of secrecy? That it makes me ignore the evidence right in front of me? No, he replied, voice steady, measured. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm asking for the chance to show you I'm on your side. Not Silas's. Not my own. Yours. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Outside, the wind rustled the prairie grasses, carrying the faint scent of rain and dust. Eliza's eyes softened, but only slightly. She still felt the sting of betrayal, the temptation to believe Silas's insinuations. But deep down, she knew that the man who had stabilized the silo, who had protected workers and equipment alike, was not entirely the man the papers portrayed. Finally, she exhaled, slow and deliberate, her hands retreating from the table. We can't afford to fall apart now, she admitted. Silas is waiting for that. We'll fight this together, but I don't trust you yet. Not fully. And I'm not pretending this evidence doesn't exist. Jake nodded, a faint, grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Good. Don't pretend. Just survive. Together. We'll deal with the rest later. The tension between them remained, raw and jagged, but the first step toward true partnership had been taken. Their conversation, laced with accusation, defense, and begrudging acknowledgement, had forced both to confront not just Silas's manipulations, but their own fears, prejudices, and vulnerabilities. As they left the office and stepped onto the porch, the sky was turning shades of orange and purple. The day ahead promised challenges, but for the first time, they faced them as allies rather than strangers forced into proximity. The partnership was fragile, built on necessity and tentative trust, but it had begun to solidify under fire. Silas had thrown his first real challenge, but he had also inadvertently strengthened the bond between them. They were no longer merely co-owners by legal decree. They were a team forged by suspicion, survival, and the unspoken understanding that failure was not an option. The wind across the plains was sharp that morning, cutting through the open spaces of the ranch like a blade. Jake and Eliza drove side by side in the old Ford pickup, heading toward the distant grain terminal, one of the largest and most isolated facilities on the property. It was a critical hub, controlling silos, feed distribution, and processing schedules. If Silas wanted to send a message, this was where it would land. Eliza gripped the edge of her notebook, flipping through contingency plans and legal documents, her mind racing. Jake, I double-checked the terminal's automated locks and emergency protocols, she said, her voice tense. We're secure, unless someone knows the override codes. Jake didn't answer immediately. His eyes were scanning the horizon, muscles coiled, hands tight around the wheel. They'll come, he said finally. Silas isn't subtle when he's losing. He'll want to create a spectacle, force us into a position where every wrong move has consequences. The terminal loomed in the distance like a fortress, steel and concrete reflecting the pale sunlight. As they drove closer, the first signs of tampering became obvious. One of the outer gates was ajar, its electronic lock disabled. The secondary fence had been cut near the perimeter, and a faint, acrid smell of burnt wiring drifted in the wind. Eliza's stomach dropped. Someone's been here. They've already bypassed security. Jake's jaw tightened. Then they're expecting us. Stay sharp. No panic. They entered the terminal cautiously, the echo of their footsteps magnified in the cavernous space. Rows of control panels, blinking indicators, and heavy machinery surrounded them. Every corner was a potential ambush, every shadow a threat. They moved as one, Jake leading with instinctual precision, Eliza following, scanning for irregularities or traps. Then it happened. A group of men, well-armed, disciplined, clearly sent by Silas, emerged from the far end of the terminal. Their goal was obvious: seize the terminal, destroy evidence, and neutralize anyone in their way. Get down, Jake barked, grabbing Eliza and pulling her behind a steel support beam. Sparks flew as a gunshot ricocheted off metal, and the echo made the space feel alive with danger. Eliza's heart raced as adrenaline surged through her veins. Jake quickly assessed the situation. We can't outrun them in this space. We need to control the environment. He grabbed a nearby valve, releasing a burst of hydraulic oil across the metal floor. The attackers slipped and staggered, cursing and losing formation. Eliza seized the opportunity, moving toward the control panels. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, cutting power to certain sections of the terminal, locking doors, and rerouting camera feeds. Jake covered her, his movements precise, powerful, yet calculated to avoid harming her. Together, they created chaos for the intruders while maintaining operational control. One attacker lunged toward Eliza, gun raised. Jake shoved her aside, absorbing the impact, and the man fell, tangled in the slick floor. The proximity, the danger, the shared survival instinct. It was more intimate than anything the contract or the surveillance cameras could ever force. Their bodies moved in tandem, reactions instinctive, minds synchronized. Eliza glanced at Jake, her heart hammering. "We can't let them get to the main server," she shouted, ducking as another shot rang out. Jake nodded. "I've got your back. Cover the panels. We move as one." Minutes stretched, each second charged with fear and urgency. Sparks flew, the smell of burnt circuitry and heated metal filled the air. Every decision had consequences. Every hesitation could be fatal. Yet in the chaos, they were united, not by law, not by contract, but by survival, by the primal need to protect one another. Finally, the last intruder was incapacitated, the terminal secure, systems stabilized, and evidence intact. Eliza sank to the floor, breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Jake crouched beside her, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. For a moment, words were unnecessary. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had survived, together. "You all right?" Jake asked finally, voice softer than it had been in hours. Eliza nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "Yeah, we made it. Together." The adrenaline slowly ebbed, leaving a different sensation behind, a connection forged in fire and fear. It was the first moment where the line between contractually enforced cooperation and genuine reliance blurred. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and most capable, and neither could unsee what that revealed. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of sirens in the distance, signaling that law enforcement, or perhaps more of Silas's men, might be approaching. But for now, Jake and Eliza had survived. The terminal was theirs. The ranch's operation remained intact. And in the crucible of danger, they had discovered a bond neither could deny, one built not on paperwork, but on shared peril. The grain terminal had quieted, but Jake and Eliza knew better than to believe the danger was over. Silas's attacks were never simple. They were a test of endurance, cunning, and resourcefulness. The adrenaline from the ambush still throbbed in their veins, but now they had a moment to plan, to strike back, not recklessly, but strategically. Eliza crouched over a bank of terminals, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Financial records, surveillance logs, supply chain contracts. Everything that Silas had manipulated or tried to hide was now at her fingertips. "If we're going to beat him," she said, voice tight with determination, "we need proof. Solid evidence of bribery, of his schemes, everything that ties him directly to the attacks and the legal manipulations." Jake moved methodically among the machines, checking pressure valves, hydraulic systems, and emergency overrides. He was calm, precise, and deadly efficient. "I'll control the environment," he said. "We can't rely on security systems alone. If Silas sends another team, they won't know what hit them." They moved as a single unit, instinctively coordinating. Eliza manipulated the digital network, rerouting camera feeds, opening hidden doors, and gathering incriminating files. Jake created controlled diversions, releasing compressed air to trigger alarms, opening maintenance hatches to redirect intruders, even using hydraulic lifts to temporarily block access points. "Almost there," Eliza muttered, eyes locked on the screen. "If I can trace the wire transfers to his personal accounts, we'll have the proof needed for law enforcement. Every bribe, every shell company, every attempt to manipulate local authorities, it's all here." Jake glanced over her shoulder, a rare, approving smile tugging at his lips. "You've got the brain for this. Let me handle the muscle." Minutes stretched, but the tension never lifted. Every movement, every keystroke, every valve adjustment could tip the balance in their favor or against them. Then came the faintest rustle in the ventilation shaft above, a subtle signal that another team had arrived. "Time to accelerate," Jake whispered. He pushed a lever, sending a controlled surge of hydraulic oil across the access ramp. The intruders slipped and faltered, giving Eliza the precious seconds she needed to copy the files onto a secure drive. She worked faster, her hands flying, knowing that any delay could mean losing everything. Jake's movements were fluid and deliberate. He guided Eliza through the chaos, shielding her, moving obstacles, and neutralizing threats without the use of weapons. His domain was the machinery, the physical environment itself. Every action was a calculated strike, a precise defense. Finally, Eliza leaned back, sweat glistening on her brow. Got it. Everything we need. Wire transfers, bribes, falsified inspections, all of it. Jake nodded. Good. Now let's get out before they realize what's happened. They moved quickly, silently navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the terminal. Eliza clutched the secure drive, Jake leading the way and shutting doors, creating delays, and ensuring no one could follow. Their coordination was seamless, muscle and mind, instinct and intellect working in perfect harmony. For the first time, they weren't simply a forced partnership. They were a team, a formidable unit capable of countering threats from both legal and physical fronts. The tension between them had shifted from mistrust and suspicion to mutual respect and reliance. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the ranch. The terminal stood silent, secure, and functional once more. But the most significant change was inside the partnership itself. Jake and Eliza had discovered that together, they could face any challenge. Combining his strength, knowledge of the land and machinery, and her intelligence, legal acumen, and strategic thinking. As they loaded the secure drive into Eliza's truck, she looked at Jake. "We're more than a contract," she said softly, almost to herself. "We're partners." Jake's eyes met hers, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "Partners who survive," he replied. And in that statement, there was no doubt, no hesitation, just the unshakable certainty that they were stronger together than apart. The ranch stretched out before them, vast and unyielding, but now it felt less like a battlefield and more like a place they could control, not just legally, but together. Silas's moves had forced them into alignment, but the real power lay in their own coordination, trust, and willingness to act as one. And for the first time, the idea of facing the year ahead didn't feel entirely hopeless. The sky over the ranch was heavy with gray clouds, a low, suffocating pressure pressing down on the land like the anticipation of a storm. Jake and Eliza approached the main house from the terminal, the secure drive in hand, knowing Silas would not remain idle. His reach was long, his patience short, and his determination to reclaim control or destroy them both, unwavering. As they entered the courtyard, Silas emerged from the shadows, flanked by two of his most ruthless enforcers. His suit was impeccable, his posture confident, and his eyes burned with a calculated fury. "Thought you could outsmart me," he sneered. "This land, this operation, it all belongs to me. And you," he said, turning toward Jake and then Eliza, "will learn that resistance has consequences." Jake stepped forward, blocking Eliza behind him, his hand brushing against the side of the truck for leverage and balance. "Not today," he said, his voice low, controlled, carrying the weight of years spent defending the ranch. Silas laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You think your tricks, your little partnership, can stop me? I built this empire. I bend laws, contracts, and people to my will. And now," he motioned, and his men advanced, weapons drawn. Eliza instinctively dropped to the ground, ducking behind the nearest cover, while Jake positioned himself between her and the attackers. "Stay down and follow my lead," he instructed, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. The first enforcer lunged forward, aiming to incapacitate Jake. But Jake pivoted, using the man's momentum against him, sending him crashing into the side of a truck. Sparks flew as metal met metal, and the other attacker hesitated for the split second Jake needed to react. Eliza moved quickly, securing the drive in her satchel and manipulating the nearest security panel. Red lights flashed as doors locked and gates closed, buying them precious seconds. She glanced at Jake, heart racing, and realized this was more than a physical confrontation. It was a test of their combined resolve, intellect, and trust. Silas advanced himself, anger twisting his features. "You're fools if you think you can survive this." Jake lunged, and the two men collided with a force that reverberated through the courtyard. Each blow was calculated, desperate, and primal. Jake's movements were instinctive, honed over years of working the land and handling machinery, but Silas was ruthless, skilled, and driven by greed. Eliza's eyes flicked between the combatants. She had a choice: intervene with the drive, potentially saving the ranch's legal evidence, or rush to Jake, whose survival now seemed uncertain. Her mind raced. The drive was the key to exposing Silas, but Jake's life was immediate, tangible, and irreplaceable. In that moment, she made a decision. She rushed forward, moving between the men, grabbing the drive, and hitting the emergency release on the nearby gates. Silas's enforcers were momentarily blocked, and Jake gained the upper hand in the scuffle, driving Silas back step by step toward the courtyard edge. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears. "Jake! Now! Take him down!" she shouted. Jake surged forward, using leverage and sheer force to subdue Silas. The final struggle was brutal but brief. Silas fell, pinned by Jake, his attempts to fight futile. His eyes darted to Eliza, a mixture of disbelief and rage, realizing the union of intellect and strength before him. Breath heaving, Jake released Silas, stepping back, letting law enforcement, alerted silently by Eliza during the confrontation, move in to secure him and his men. Silas was cuffed, shouting threats that no one heard over the pounding of adrenaline in the victor's veins. Eliza collapsed onto the grass beside Jake, her chest heaving. We did it," she whispered, barely believing it herself. Jake sat down beside her, covered in sweat and dirt, his hand brushing hers in a rare, unguarded gesture. "Yeah," he said, voice rough but calm. "We did it. Together. For the first time, there was no legal contract, no external coercion, no need for pretense. They had survived together, relied on each other, and conquered Silas not through paperwork alone, but through trust, coordination, and courage." The ranch stretched around them, vast and resilient, like the bond they had forged. Eliza clutched the drive, evidence of Silas's crimes now undeniable, yet it was the shared experience, the trust, the fear, the strategy, the fight, that bound her to Jake more than any legal stipulation ever could. As clouds broke and sunlight spilled across the fields, they rose to their feet, exhausted, bruised, but unbroken. The storm had passed. Silas was defeated. And in the quiet aftermath, with the land around them safe and the future theirs to shape, they understood a simple truth. Survival had made them partners, but the trial by fire had made them something more, irreplaceable to one another. The first light of morning stretched across the vast Montana plains, painting the ranch in soft gold and amber. A cool breeze rustled the tall grasses, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain, and for the first time in months, the land felt at peace. The battle with Silas was over. The terminal secured, the legal evidence in hand, the last of his enforcers in custody. The ranch belonged to no one but those who genuinely cared for it. Jake and Eliza stood side by side on the porch of the main house, their silhouettes outlined against the rising sun. Both were exhausted, clothes stained with dust, sweat, and remnants of the previous day's struggle, but their faces bore the quiet satisfaction of survival and triumph. No contract bound them now. Nothing remained except choice, trust, and a shared sense of purpose. Eliza turned to Jake, the weight of the past year and the intensity of the final confrontation settling over her. "It's finally over," she whispered, almost to herself. "Silas can't touch this place anymore." Jake's eyes met hers, unwavering. "No, and he won't. Not ever again. This land, our work, it's ours now, and we get to protect it together." She smiled faintly, a mixture of relief, pride, and something deeper she hadn't admitted even to herself until now. "Together," she repeated, letting the word linger, testing it, tasting it. It no longer felt like a burden of obligation, but a promise made by choice. The ranch was alive with activity in the distance, workers tending to machinery, livestock grazing, the hum of generators and grain elevators resuming normal operations. Everything was a testament to resilience and determination, but more importantly, it reflected the unity that had grown between Jake and Eliza. The forced marriage, the constant threat from Silas, the dangers they had faced, it had forged something far stronger than legal necessity. Jake reached for her hand, And for the first time, there was no hesitation, no legal contract, no calculated distance. His fingers intertwined with hers naturally, almost instinctively. "We survived everything together," he said softly, "and I can't imagine doing this with anyone else." Eliza's eyes glistened in the dawn light, and she leaned slightly toward him. "Neither can I," she admitted, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We didn't need a will, a contract, or a threat to make this work. We just did." They stood there for a long moment, the wind carrying the sounds of the ranch and the promise of a new beginning. It was more than survival. It was victory, partnership, and a bond forged in fire, trust, and shared purpose. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the fields and the grain silos, Jake and Eliza walked together toward the heart of the ranch. Each step was a choice, free from coercion or obligation, yet grounded in the understanding that they were stronger together. They had endured manipulation, danger, and betrayal, and emerged not just intact, but inseparable. The ranch stretched endlessly around them, a living testament to resilience, hard work, and the courage to protect what truly mattered. Jake and Eliza had inherited not just property or responsibility, but a partnership rooted in trust, respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. The wind swept across the plains, carrying with it a quiet, enduring truth. The land was theirs, the past defeated, and the future theirs to shape. And in that sunrise, amidst the scent of earth and the soft murmur of machinery, Jake and Eliza finally understood that the most valuable inheritance wasn't legal, it was each other. Thank you for listening to the story. Write your thoughts in the comments.